The envelope hit the floor before Rowena Ashcroft even opened her eyes. She heard it, that sharp, deliberate slap of paper against hardwood, and knew exactly who had pushed it under her door. Not a knock, no voice, just the cold, calculated sound of a man who believed he had already won. She crossed the floor barefoot, picked it up, and read 3 words that stopped her breathing entirely. Lease termination notice, signed by Darius Holt, her dead husband's brother, dated that very morning, the morning of the hearing. Outside, a rooster called. The sky was still gray, and somewhere across the yard she could hear Darius's truck idling in her own driveway like he had already moved in. If you have ever had someone try to take everything from you while you were still grieving, you already know what Rowena felt standing there in her bare feet, holding that paper. And if you haven't, ask yourself honestly, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to you, if you believe that quiet people sometimes carry the loudest courage, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week I bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's go back to Iron Creek and to the morning that changed everything. The notice was 1 page, typed, not handwritten, which told Rowena everything she needed to know about Darius Holt. He had not even had the decency to write it himself. He had gotten someone in town to type it up, probably the same clerk at the land office who always smiled too wide whenever Darius walked in, the one who called her Mrs. Ashcroft in that particular tone that people use when they have already decided you are finished. She set the paper on the kitchen table and put the kettle on. Not because she was calm. She put it on because her hands needed something to do, and because Thomas, her husband, dead 11 months now, had always said that decisions made before the kettle boils are decisions you will spend the rest of your life regretting. She missed him. That thought arrived every single morning without invitation, without softening, just blunt and permanent as an iron post driven into frozen ground. She missed the sound of his boots on the porch steps. She missed the specific way he smelled after a long day. Cedar smoke and saddle leather, and something she had never been able to name but could still call up perfectly in a quiet room. She missed having someone to be angry at other than herself. The kettle screamed. She poured the water, set the mug on the table beside the notice, and read the whole thing again, slower this time. The language was careful. Darius had not accused her of anything outright. He was too smart for that. The notice cited insufficient operational capacity, meaning she did not have enough crew. It cited livestock depletion below sustainable threshold, meaning she had lost too many calves. And it invoked a clause in the original land charter, one she had not known existed, which granted the county lease board the authority to reassign management of any frontier ranch operating below 60% productive capacity for more than 9 consecutive months. She had been at 53% for 10 months. What the notice did not say, what it was very careful not to say, was how those calves had disappeared, whether they had wandered off, or been rustled, or died of illness, or simply ceased to exist the way livestock sometimes do in the hard country. It just noted the numbers, the cold, final numbers. She folded the notice, set it aside, drank her tea and stared at the window where the sky was beginning to lighten from gray to a pale, colorless white that looked less like dawn and more like something giving up. The lease hearing was at noon. She had exactly 6 hours. Rowena Ashcroft was 51 years old, and she was not a woman who cried easily. She had not cried at Thomas's funeral, though she had wanted to badly enough that her jaw ached for 3 days afterward from clenching it. She had not cried when her nearest neighbor, Pete Gallagher, had quietly stopped showing up to help with fencing, the way good neighbors do when they can see which way the wind is blowing and have decided they would rather not be standing near you when the storm hits. She had not cried when the feed store in Caldwell started requiring payment up front instead of running her tab the way they had done for 12 years. She had not cried, but she had noticed every single one of those things, and she had stored them somewhere in her chest where they sat like river stones, heavy, smooth, and permanent. What people did not understand, what she suspected nobody in Harrow County understood, was that she had not come to Iron Creek as someone's wife first. She had come as herself. She had grown up in dry country 2 states east, worked cattle before she could drive a truck, and met Thomas Ashcroft at a stock auction in September of a year so long ago it seemed like something that had happened to a different woman. She had loved him completely, but she had not needed him to survive. She had simply chosen to build something with him, and when he died, she had refused to believe that his death was also the death of everything they had built. That refusal was what Darius Holt could not forgive. He had expected grief to hollow her out. He had expected the first winter alone to break something essential in her. He had visited twice in the first 2 months after the funeral, each time with that particular expression men sometimes wear when they believe they are being generous but are actually conducting a quiet inspection, assessing load-bearing walls for cracks, checking the foundation for soft spots, testing whether she was going to hold. She had held, and Darius had left both times without saying what he came to say, which meant he had gone back to town and started making other arrangements. She understood all of that now, standing at her kitchen window watching his truck sit in her driveway with its engine running. He had been patient. She would give him that. He had waited nearly a year. He had let her struggle, let the numbers drop, let the calves go missing without making a single noise about it, because he had known from the beginning that the lease clause was there. He had probably read it the week Thomas died, maybe before. That thought made her knuckles go white against her mug. She changed into her working clothes before anything else. Not her hearing clothes, she would change for those later. But first she wanted to walk the property the way she did every morning, because Iron Creek Range deserved at least that much from her, regardless of what happened at noon. The air outside was cold and clear and smelled like juniper and something faintly electric, the way air smells before weather that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. The cattle that remained, 18 head, which was half what she had started the year with, were gathered near the east water tank. She counted them out of habit, counted them twice, the way Thomas had taught her, because the count that matters is always the second one. Still 18. She was walking the fence line along the north pasture when she heard the truck. Not Darius's truck. His had finally gone quiet somewhere after sunrise. This was a different engine. Older, rougher at idle, the kind of roughness that comes not from neglect, but from a vehicle that has simply worked hard for a long time and been kept running through stubbornness and practical repair rather than replacement parts. She did not turn around immediately. She had learned in the past several months to be cautious about vehicles she did not recognize coming onto her land. Twice she had encountered men claiming to be interested in purchasing livestock. Once she had found a man near the South Canyon Gate who said he was a surveyor and could not produce any credentials when she asked. She had sent all of them away with language that was considerably more direct than anything she would have used 12 months ago. She finished the section of fence she was examining, a loose post that needed attention, and then turned. The truck was parked just inside the gate, motor off, driver's door open. The man who had climbed out was somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, hard to say exactly, with the kind of face that has spent enough years in weather that age becomes approximate. He was not tall, maybe 5'11", but he had a way of standing that made him seem settled, like he had been planted in that particular spot and was not going anywhere unless he had decided to. He wore a canvas work coat that had been mended in at least 2 places she could see from 20 yards away. His hat was plain. His boots were not. The boots she noticed because they were the boots of someone who had spent real time on horseback. Not decorative, not worn for effect. Worked. He did not walk toward her immediately. He stood by his truck and waited, which she appreciated. Men who charge toward you on your own land before you have invited them are men who do not understand the first thing about whose land it is. Then she noticed the passenger door. It opened slowly, and a child climbed out. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, with dark braids and eyes that were doing exactly what her father's were not, scanning everything, tracking, taking account of the entire property with a systematic quiet attention that was unusual enough in an adult and almost startling in a child. The girl stepped close to the man's side, not hiding behind him exactly, but close. Rowena walked toward them. "Morning," the man said when she was close enough. His voice was even, not friendly in a performed way, just level. "Morning," she said. "Can I help you?" He looked at her directly, not the way some men look at a woman on a ranch alone, not assessing for vulnerability, not calculating, just direct, the way you look at someone when you intend to be honest with them. "I was in town yesterday afternoon," he said. "I heard you need a rancher." She studied him. Who told you that? He paused just a moment. Hardware store. Man behind the counter. I was asking about work in the area, and he said Iron Creek might have need. Said it like he wasn't sure whether he was doing you a favor or not. That would be Earl Maddox at Caldwell Hardware. Earl was not a bad man. He was just the kind of man who repeated information without thinking hard about whether it was his to repeat. I need a crew, she said. Not a single hand. I know, the man said. I heard that part too. He did not say anything else. He let that sit. She looked at the child. The girl was looking at the barn now with that same careful attention. She had something in her hand, a small piece of wood or bark. Rowena couldn't tell from where she stood. She yours? Rowena asked. Yes, ma'am. Elsie. He said it simply, with no additional explanation, the way you say something that is simply true and does not require elaboration. What's your name? Silas Boone. Where are you coming from, Silas Boone? High country, past the Harrow Ridge. Had a place up there for 6 years. Lost it last spring. He said this without drama. No bid for sympathy in his voice, just the plain shape of a fact. Lost it how? He met her eyes. Partner drank. I bought him out when I could, but by then there was more debt than land. Took the better part of a year to clear my name from what he'd signed. I've got references from the Calhoun outfit in Teller County and from a woman named Margaret Reese who ran the Reese Creek property for 20 years before she sold. I can get you those names today if you want to make calls. She did not say anything for a moment. Most people, when they are trying to persuade you of something, talk too much. They fill the silence because silence feels like doubt, and they cannot bear the thought that you might be doubting them. Silas Boone had said what he needed to say and stopped. He was standing in the cold morning air on her land, hat in hand now. He had taken it off at some point without her noticing, and he was simply waiting. That was unusual enough that it made her pay attention. I have a lease hearing at noon, she said. I heard that too. Then you know what this place is worth right now. I know what it looks like from the outside, he said. I don't know what it's worth yet. That's not something you can see from a road. Something about that landed differently than she expected. She had braced for a pitch, for someone to tell her that the place had potential, that with the right management everything would turn around. All the optimistic language that people use when they want something from you and have decided that flattery is cheaper than honesty. She had heard variations of it from 3 different men in the past 4 months and had sent all 3 of them away. Silas had not said any of that. He had said he didn't know. And there was something in that honesty, in its plainness and its accuracy, that she found herself responding to in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she wanted. I can't pay much, she said. Not yet. Honest wages, he said. That's all I'm asking for. Honest wages on a ranch that might not exist by 1 o'clock this afternoon. Then I'll have wasted half a morning and some fuel. He said it without bitterness. That's the risk on my end. But I'm standing here because I think this place is worth the risk. On yours. Rowena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the child. Elsie had moved slightly closer to the barn, studying something near the base of the doorframe. She crouched down without looking back at her father, without asking permission, just crouching down with that absolute focus children have when they have found something that interests them. She was turning the piece of wood over in her hands, and now Rowena could see it more clearly. It was a fragment of cedar, burned at one edge, with marks on it that looked like they might be deliberate. Elsie, Silas said quietly. The child looked up at him, not startled, just checking in. That's the lady's barn, he said. Don't go touching things without asking. Elsie looked at Rowena. She held up the cedar piece, a silent question. Where did you find that? Rowena asked. The girl pointed. Not at the barn. Down the drive, toward the south, toward the canyon. Rowena felt something move in her chest that she couldn't quite name. A shift. Like when you have been carrying something at an angle for so long that the wrongness of it has become normal, and then someone adjusts the weight by half an inch and you feel, for just a moment, how it was supposed to feel all along. Come inside, she said finally. I'll make more tea. You can tell me about those references. She turned and walked toward the house. After a moment, she heard 2 sets of footsteps follow her. One steady and measured, one lighter and slightly behind. She had 6 hours until the hearing. A ranch that might be taken from her by noon. A brother-in-law idling somewhere down the road in a truck with the engine running. And somehow, she had just invited two strangers into her kitchen. Thomas would have done the same thing. That thought arrived without warning, and it didn't hurt the way she expected it to. It just felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something other than being alone. Silas drank his tea the way he did everything else, without ceremony, without comment on whether it was good or bad, just steadily, with both hands around the mug, like a man who understood the value of warmth when it was offered. Elsie sat beside him at the kitchen table and did not touch her mug at first. She set the burned cedar piece on the table between them and looked at it the way children look at things they have decided are important but cannot yet explain. Her eyes tracked over it slowly, then moved to the window, then back to it. She had not said a single word since arriving, and Rowena had begun to wonder whether the child simply didn't speak much, or whether she was making a specific decision not to, the way some people go quiet in unfamiliar places until they have taken full measure of their surroundings. Rowena pulled Margaret Reese's name up from her memory while she refilled her own mug. She had heard that name before. Years back, Thomas had mentioned a woman running a cattle operation north of Teller County, someone who had built the place from almost nothing after her first partner walked out. Thomas had spoken about her the way he spoke about people he genuinely respected, which was rare and therefore memorable. "Margaret Reese," she said, sitting back down. Thomas knew of her. Silas looked up. "Good woman. Ran a hard outfit. Didn't accept poor work and didn't offer excuses when she gave poor work herself, which wasn't often." He paused. "How long has your husband been gone?" 11 months. He nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't spent the past 11 months receiving condolences from people who delivered them like invoices. Obligatory, transactional, already forgotten before the words finished leaving their mouths. "The calves," she said. "I need to tell you about the calves before you decide whether this is worth your time." "All right," she told him. "Not everything, not yet, but the shape of it. 34 calves at the start of the year, 18 gone by September, which the county veterinarian had attributed to a combination of illness and predator activity. She had accepted that explanation because she had no reason not to, because she had been managing grief and fencing and feed costs and a water pump that had failed in July, and because accepting the explanation was easier than finding the energy to question it. "Wolf kills leave sign," Silas said when she finished. "I know. Did you find sign?" She was quiet for a moment. "I found 2 carcasses in the north pasture in March." The vet looked at them and said, "Predator." "I didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't look as carefully as I should have. I was in a bad place in March." "That's understandable," he said. Not dismissively, just as a statement of fact. "It's also how you lose a ranch," she said, and the sharpness in her own voice surprised her slightly. Not anger at Silas. Anger at herself, the specific and useless kind that arrives about 10 months too late to do any good. Elsie looked up from the cedar piece. She looked at Rowena with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not pity, not sympathy, exactly. Something more watchful, like she was deciding something. Then she picked up the cedar piece and held it out across the table. Rowena took it, turned it over. The burn on one edge was not random. She could see that now in the kitchen light. It was a controlled burn, the kind you get from a branding iron applied for a specific duration. And beneath the char there were marks in the wood itself, pressed in, not painted, like something had been stamped into the cedar before it burned. She looked closer. She had seen that shape before, or something close to it. The lines were partially destroyed by the burn, but the basic form, 2 curves and a vertical, nagged at something in her memory. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked Elsie directly. The child reached across the table and tapped the cedar piece once, then held up 2 fingers, then pointed south. "2 of them?" Rowena asked. "South of here?" Elsie nodded. "How far south?" The girl thought about it. Then she held up both hands, spread her fingers, and moved them slowly. A gesture that Rowena read after a moment as a walking distance. A long walk. "You found this on the way in," Rowena said. "This morning." Another nod. Silas was watching his daughter with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite worry, something between the two, the kind of expression a parent wears when their child does something that is impressive and also slightly alarming in its implications. "She finds things," he said simply. "Always has." I stopped being surprised. Rowena set the cedar piece down carefully. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was not yet 8. She had 4 hours. "I need to make a phone call," she said. "Excuse me." She went to the back room where Thomas's old desk still sat exactly as he had left it, because she had not been able to bring herself to reorganize it, and because there was something about the particular disorder of his papers, the layered archaeological record of his way of working, that she was not ready to flatten into order. She found the number she needed in the address book in the second drawer. Margaret Reese, still listed with the Teller County Exchange. She dialed. It rang 6 times. She was about to hang up when a woman's voice answered, dry, brisk, the voice of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something physical. "Reese?" "Mrs. Reese, my name is Rowena Ashcroft. I run Iron Creek Range in Harrow County. I have a man named Silas Boone sitting in my kitchen asking for work, and he listed you as a reference." There was a short pause. "Silas Boone," the woman repeated. Not a question. A confirmation, as if she was locating him in some internal inventory. "He's there." "Yes, ma'am." "How'd he look?" Rowena hesitated at the unexpected nature of the question. "Fine. He looks fine. His daughter's with him." "Elsie." Another confirmation. Then, "Mrs. Ashcroft, I'll tell you exactly what I told the last person who called me about Silas Boone, and that was the Calhoun outfit 3 years ago. He is the most reliable man I have ever had on a property. He doesn't drink. He doesn't borrow. He doesn't take shortcuts that he doesn't tell you about. If he takes a shortcut, he'll explain why the shortcut is actually the correct approach, and 9 times out of 10, he'll be right." She paused. "He is also not easy. He'll tell you when you're wrong. He won't be polite about it. And if you try to ask him to do something that goes against the way he believes a ranch ought to be run, he'll push back and keep pushing until one of you quits." "That doesn't sound like a recommendation," Rowena said. "It's the highest one I can give," Margaret Reese said. "I've been in this business for 26 years, and the men who tell you what you want to hear are the men who cost you cattle. The men who tell you what's true are the ones who save a place." She paused again. "You said Iron Creek Range, Thomas Ashcroft's operation." "My operation," Rowena said carefully. A beat of silence. "Yes," Margaret Reese said. "I imagine it is. Good luck at your hearing, Mrs. Ashcroft." The line went quiet. Rowena sat at Thomas's desk for a moment with the receiver in her hand. Then she set it down and went back to the kitchen. Silas had washed both his and Elsie's mugs while she was gone. He was standing at the sink, looking out the window toward the north pasture where her cattle were, and he had the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Not financial arithmetic, but the other kind, the kind where the numbers are things like fence condition and water availability and the weight of the animals at a distance. "Margaret Reese says you push back," Rowena said from the doorway. He turned. "She's right. She also says you're the most reliable man she's put on a property. She's right about that too. No false modesty, no performance of humility, just acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a measurement that is accurate." Elsie was at the kitchen table again, but she had moved the cedar piece to the side and had taken a small notebook from somewhere, a back pocket, Rowena thought, and was drawing in it with a stub of pencil. Rowena couldn't see what she was drawing from across the room. "I have a problem," Rowena said, sitting down across from him at the table. "The lease board doesn't care how reliable you are. They care about operational capacity, 60%. I'm at 53, and I've been there for 10 months, which means the clause is already triggered. What I need at that hearing is not references. I need evidence that those numbers are wrong, that the calves didn't die, that they were taken." Silas sat down. He looked at the cedar piece, then at Elsie's notebook. "You think your brother-in-law has your calves?" It was not quite a question. "I think he's had them for months," Rowena said. "I think he knew about that lease clause before Thomas was in the ground, and I think he made sure my numbers dropped enough to trigger it." She said this steadily, because she had made herself say it out loud twice already this morning, once in the mirror, once to the empty kitchen before Silas arrived, so that it would not crack her voice when it mattered. "That's a serious accusation without evidence," Silas said. "I know. What makes you think the cedar piece is connected?" She looked at it. "I don't know yet, but Elsie found 2 of them, both south of here, both near the canyon, and the marks—" She turned it toward him. "Do those look deliberate to you?" He leaned in and looked at the piece for a long time without touching it. Yes, he said finally. That's a brand impression. Partial. The burn destroyed part of it, but the bottom section is still there. Whose brand? Can't tell from this fragment. You'd need the whole mark. He sat back. But if someone was burning cedar scraps to cover branded fragments, that's not accidental. That's a person cleaning up after themselves. Rowena looked at the clock. 3 hours and 40 minutes. I need to get to that canyon before the hearing, she said. That's a lot of ground to cover in under 4 hours. I know. He didn't tell her it was impossible. He didn't tell her it was foolish. He looked at Elsie, who had stopped drawing and was looking at her father with an expression of absolute steadiness, a child waiting for the decision she had already calculated he would make. Elsie, he said, show Mrs. Ashcroft where you found the second piece. The girl closed her notebook and stood up. She looked at Rowena, and for the first time that morning, she almost smiled. Not quite, but close. They took Silas's truck because it handled the south terrain better. Rowena's had a rear axle issue she had been managing with strategic driving for 6 weeks and hadn't had the money to fix. She sat in the passenger seat with the cedar piece in her lap and her mind running the calculations she had been avoiding all morning. If the calves were in the canyon, she needed a witness, more than one. She needed someone with authority to confirm what she found, or the lease board would dismiss it as a desperate widow's story constructed the morning of her own hearing. She had one person she thought might help, Raymond Eccles, who ran the south parcel adjacent to Iron Creek and who had been the closest thing to a neutral party in Harrow County for the past 30 years. Raymond was 73, moved slowly, and had opinions about everything. He also had a reputation for honesty that even Darius Holt's money had not been able to purchase. She called him from the truck. He picked up on the second ring. Raymond, I need you to come south with me this morning, before the hearing. Rowena. His voice was careful. I'm not sure that's a good idea for me, politically speaking. Raymond, I'm asking you to look at something. Just look. You don't have to say a word until you've seen it. A long pause. Raymond Eccles had known Thomas Ashcroft for 20 years. He had stood at the funeral and gripped his hat with both hands and said nothing, but he had stayed until the very last person left. She was counting on that meaning something. Where south? He asked finally. Split Tooth Canyon Access Road, 40 minutes. Another pause. I'll be there. She put the phone down. Silas was driving without comment, but she noticed he had taken the south road already without being told, which meant Elsie had already given him directions by some method Rowena had not witnessed. Your daughter, she said. Does she talk? She can, Silas said. She chooses when. Since when? He kept his eyes on the road. Since her mother left. 3 years ago. He said it without blame in his voice, without anger, without any of the emotions that Rowena might have expected. Just the fact of it, placed gently in the space between them. The doctor said she'd come back to it when she was ready. She says more every year, just not in words mostly. Rowena looked at Elsie in the back seat. The girl was watching the scrubland pass outside her window with that same systematic attention she had given to the barn, to the cedar piece, to everything, taking inventory. She communicates just fine, Rowena said carefully. Better than most people with full vocabularies, Silas agreed. They drove in silence for a while. The road roughened as it moved south, and the scrubland thickened on either side, juniper and sage, and the occasional skeletal cottonwood standing in the low places where water ran in spring and dried to cracked earth by July. The canyon was not visible yet, but she could feel the land beginning to fold, the slight drop in elevation that always preceded the cut. Then Elsie leaned forward between the seats and touched her father's shoulder once. He braked. They were on a flat stretch of Caliche Road, nothing obviously significant about the location, but Elsie was already reaching for her door handle, and when Silas looked at Rowena, she nodded, and they both got out. Elsie walked directly off the road to the left, through a low stand of sage, to a spot near a limestone outcrop where the ground was slightly disturbed. Not dramatically, not the way ground looks after a struggle, but the way it looks after something heavy has been moved across it. Dragged, maybe. Or walked through repeatedly over a long period, packed down by consistent traffic. She crouched at the base of the limestone and reached into a crack in the rock face. She pulled out a second cedar fragment, larger than the first. The burn pattern was similar, but this piece had survived better. The brand impression on it was nearly complete. Rowena took it and held it next to the first piece. Together, the two fragments formed a brand she recognized instantly. Her throat closed. It was the Holt brand. Darius Holt's registered mark, two curves and a vertical, which was the stylized DH that Darius had filed with the county office 7 years ago. She had seen it on paperwork, on Darius's trucks, on the gate of his property 12 miles north. But that was not the part that stopped her breathing. The part that stopped her breathing was what she could see on the inner face of the larger fragment, the face that had been pressed against the rock, protected from the burn. There, faintly but unmistakably, was a second impression. Older, pressed deeper into the cedar grain, the way a brand looks when it's been used hundreds of times on the same piece of marking wood. Iron Creek's brand, Thomas's brand, her brand. Someone had used the Iron Creek branding cedar to make a new impression of the Holt mark. They had tried to burn away the original. They had almost succeeded. She stood up with both pieces in her hands and looked at Silas. He had seen it. She could tell from the set of his jaw, that particular stillness that comes over a person when they have just watched a suspicion become a certainty. He was using your equipment, Silas said. He branded your calves with his mark, using your own branding cedar, then tried to destroy the evidence. Using cedar from my property, Rowena said. Her voice was flat. Which means someone had access to my land, to my equipment. Not recently. Look at the depth of the original impression. This was not done this year. Silas looked at the fragment. Thomas's era, he said quietly. Before Thomas died, she said, or right after. While I was... She stopped. While she was not looking. While she was in the bad place that March had been, that the whole past winter had been. While she had been managing grief and accepting explanations because questioning them required a kind of energy she had not had. She had been standing in her own house, grieving her husband, while Darius Holt walked her land and used her tools to steal from her. The anger that came then was not the kind that makes you shake. It was the colder kind. The kind that settles in the bottom of your chest and just stays. Permanent. Useful. Raymond Eccles is meeting us at the canyon access, she said. We need to move. Raymond Eccles was already parked at the split-tooth access road when they arrived, sitting in his truck with the window down, and an expression on his face that fell somewhere between resignation and curiosity. He was a lean, white-haired man with the permanently squinted look of someone who had spent decades reading weather, and he climbed out of his truck slowly but without assistance, the way old men do when they have decided they do not need help and mean for that to be clearly understood. He looked at Silas. Don't know you, he said. Silas Boone, Silas said. Mountain outfit, Harrow Ridge. I'm working Iron Creek as of this morning. Raymond raised an eyebrow at Rowena. He is, she confirmed. Raymond looked at Elsie, who was already moving toward the canyon access gate, with the certainty of someone who had been here before or who simply always knew where she was going. Who's the child? His daughter, Rowena said. She found the evidence. Raymond looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he looked at the two cedar fragments she was holding out toward him. He took them without comment, examined them. His squint deepened. That's your mark underneath, he said. Yes. He turned the larger fragment over twice more. Then he handed it back. He put both hands in his coat pockets and looked toward the canyon and did not say anything for what felt like a long time. All right, he said finally. Show me the rest. The canyon gate was chained but not locked. The chain was looped in a way that looked locked from a distance, but released with a simple pull, a trick Rowena recognized from fences on her own property. Someone had been through here regularly enough to want easy access without advertising it. They went through this gate and followed Elsie down the rocky switchback path into the cut of Split Tooth Canyon, where the walls rose on both sides and the light changed to something thinner and more particular, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more real than it does in open country, every detail sharpened by the contrast. Elsie did not hesitate. She moved through the canyon the way she moved through everything, without wasted motion, with a certainty that had no performance in it. She rounded a bend in the path, past a dense stand of pine that grew close enough to the canyon wall to partially obscure what was behind it, and stopped. She turned and looked back at Rowena. And Rowena came around the pine stand and stopped walking entirely. Behind a rough gate of lashed pine poles, in a natural wide spot in the canyon floor where the walls opened into something almost like a room, stood calves, dozens of them. Young cattle, well fed, watered from a temporary tank someone had filled by hand or truck, carrying brands on their left flanks. The Holt brand. Fresh, maybe weeks old. Rowena walked to the nearest animal. She put her hand on its flank over the brand. The hair was still slightly uneven there, the way it grows back wrong after a branding, the skin still slightly pink at the edge if you looked close enough. She looked close. And beneath the fresh Holt mark, underneath the new burn that had been laid carefully over the existing hide, she saw what she already knew she was going to see. The ghost of Thomas's brand, the original Iron Creek mark, pressed into the skin months or years before the new one had tried to cover it, permanent in the way that the oldest things are permanent. Not because they cannot be damaged, but because the damage itself becomes the record. Raymond Eccles stood beside her. He had not spoken since the canyon gate. He looked at the brand on the calf for a long time. Then he looked at the cedar fragments she still held in her other hand. Then he looked at the full canyon full of stolen animals. He took his hat off. "Rowena," he said. His voice had something in it she had not heard from him before, something that might have been shame. "I should have come out here months ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He didn't argue with that. He just stood there with his hat in his hands, which was the most honest thing she had seen from a neighbor in nearly a year. Silas was already on his phone. Calling who, she didn't know yet, but his voice was low and purposeful, and he was facing away from the group with the posture of someone handling logistics, which was exactly what needed handling. The hearing was in just over 2 hours. The sheriff's office was 40 minutes away. The lease board offices were in town, 25 minutes from the canyon. There was enough time. Barely, not comfortably, but enough. Elsie was standing at the canyon wall near the pine gate, looking up at the rock face with her notebook out. She was drawing something, rapidly, not her usual measured examination, but something more urgent. When Rowena walked over and looked, she saw that the child was drawing the brand marks from memory, both the old one and the new, placing them side by side in the small notebook, with the accuracy of someone who had looked at both long enough to hold them precisely. A 9-year-old child, whose mother had left, who had come to a stranger's ranch on a cold morning with a cedar fragment in her hand and an attention to detail that had just unraveled months of careful theft in the space of 3 hours. Rowena put her hand briefly on Elsie's shoulder. The girl did not look up from her drawing, but she leaned into the touch just slightly for just a moment and then straightened again. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Silas's call was to the Harrow County Sheriff's Dispatch. Rowena heard fragments of it: brand tampering, livestock concealment, active evidence at Split Tooth Canyon, delivered in the same level voice he used for everything, which somehow made it sound more serious than if he had shouted. Dispatch asked him to hold. He held. Raymond Eccles used the time to walk the perimeter of the hidden pen, counting animals with the slow, deliberate method of a man who understood that whatever number he arrived at would be the number that mattered in a courtroom, and he was going to arrive at it correctly. Rowena stood in the middle of the canyon with 37 calves around her and 2 cedar fragments in her hand and tried to think clearly. The problem was not finding the evidence. She had found it. The problem was time, jurisdiction, and the specific personality of the Harrow County Lease Board, which was a 3-person body that met 4 times a year and was chaired by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had done business with Darius Holt for the better part of a decade and had the kind of careful neutrality that is indistinguishable from quiet loyalty until you need him to actually be neutral. She had dealt with Gerald Pruitt twice since Thomas died. Both times he had been perfectly cordial and completely useless. Silas came back from his call. "Deputy is 40 minutes out. They're sending 2 units because of the livestock count." "The hearing is in 2 hours and 10 minutes, she said. "I know." "Pruitt is going to want to table everything pending a formal investigation. That's his standard move when something complicates a hearing he's already decided." Silas looked at her. "Has he already decided?" "Darius has given money to every civic project Gerald Pruitt has put his name on for the past 8 years. The new road grading equipment, the fairgrounds expansion, the Historical Preservation Fund, which is a particularly rich joke given what we're standing in right now." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to soften it. "So yes, I think Gerald Pruitt walked into that hearing room this morning, having already decided." Raymond had completed his count and was walking back toward them. 41 head, he said, all young stock, all carrying fresh Holt brands over older marks. He paused. Rowena, I can see the underlying brand on at least a dozen of them without needing any special equipment. It's not subtle. Whoever did the rebranding was working fast or working cheap, or both. Or working confident, Silas said quietly. Confident that nobody was going to look. That landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Because that was the truth of it, the part that was hardest to absorb. Not that Darius had been clever, but that he hadn't needed to be. He had counted on her grief, on her isolation, on the cooperative silence of a community that had decided she was already finished. He had not built an airtight scheme. He had built a barely adequate one, and it had almost worked, because barely adequate is sufficient when nobody is looking. Elsie was still at the canyon wall. She had finished drawing and was now doing something else, pressing her fingers along the rock face at a specific spot, methodically, the way you run your hand along a wall in the dark looking for a switch. Rowena watched her for a moment, then looked away. She had learned in the past 3 hours that when Elsie focused on something, the correct response was to let her focus. I need to get to that hearing, Rowena said, with the evidence, with Raymond, and with whatever the deputy can give me in writing before noon. A deputy's verbal confirmation that evidence exists isn't the same as a completed investigation report, Raymond said. Pruitt will point that out. I know what Pruitt will point out, she said. I also know that there is a difference between what Pruitt can say in a closed hearing room and what he can say when Raymond Eccles is sitting across the table from him. She looked at Raymond. You're coming. It was not a question. Raymond understood that. He put his hat back on. Yes, he said. I am. She photographed everything before the deputies arrived. She used her phone, moving systematically through the pen, documenting each animal, each brand, each ghost mark visible through the newer burn. She photographed the cedar fragments against the animal's flanks where the shapes aligned. She photographed the pine gate, the water tank, the tracks in the canyon floor that showed repeated vehicle access from the north, from the direction of Darius Holt's property, not from Iron Creek. She was methodical about it. She had not been methodical about things she should have examined in March or in April or in the long, slow months when the numbers dropped, and she accepted the explanations offered to her because she was tired and grieving and alone. She was not going to fail at methodical again. The first deputy arrived at 43 minutes, not 40, which would have been impressive, but close enough. His name was Crane, young enough that she didn't recognize him, with the specific kind of professional seriousness that new deputies wear when they are aware that a situation is significant and are being careful not to show that it is slightly larger than what they have handled before. He looked at the calves. He looked at the brands. He took his own photos and wrote in a notebook and asked Rowena and Raymond and Silas each a set of careful questions in turn. He was thorough. He was also, she realized, approximately 26 years old, and making decisions about a situation that had legal and political dimensions he did not fully have the experience to navigate. I need something in writing, she told him, before 11:30. Whatever you can give me officially confirming that you attended this location, observed the livestock, and noted the brand discrepancies. He hesitated. That would typically go through Deputy Crane, Raymond said from beside her. I am Raymond Eccles. I have been a registered landowner in Harrow County for 41 years, and I am prepared to stand in front of the lease board in 1 hour and 40 minutes and tell them personally what I observed this morning. What I am asking you to do is provide a written record that a law enforcement officer also observed it. You do not have to characterize it, investigate it, or draw any conclusions. You simply have to confirm that you were here and you saw what you saw. Deputy Crane looked at Raymond for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to his vehicle to write up the field observation report. Raymond turned to Rowena and said nothing. But something in his expression had shifted from the vague shame she had seen earlier into something more purposeful. He had spent months being carefully neutral, which had cost her something she could not entirely calculate. He appeared to understand that, and to have decided that the calculation was done. The second deputy arrived while Crane was writing. An older man, heavy-set, who Rowena recognized as Gareth Solis. He had known Thomas, had come to the funeral, had shaken her hand afterward with a grip that communicated something genuine even if he hadn't said it. He took one look at the hidden pen, the calves, the brands, and said, "Well, damn, with the flatness of a man who has seen enough of human behavior that he is rarely surprised but remains capable of being disgusted. "Solus," she said, "Mrs. Ashcroft." He looked at the cedar fragments she was still holding. She handed them to him without being asked. He examined them the way Raymond had, carefully, without performance, with the attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. "These were found on your property?" "The first one near my barn, the second near the canyon access road, by Elsie Boone." She gestured toward the child who had come back from the canyon wall and was standing near Silas, watching Solus with her characteristic unwavering attention. Solus looked at the girl. "How old is she?" "9, Silas said. Solus looked at the cedar fragments again. "9, he repeated, with a quality in his voice that might have been wonder, or might have been something closer to embarrassment on behalf of the adults who had not found what a 9-year-old had. "The hearing is in under 2 hours, Rowena said. "I know when the hearing is," Solus said. He handed the cedar fragments back carefully. "I'll call the sheriff directly. This goes above a field observation. This is evidence of a deliberate crime, potentially premeditated, given the time frame you're describing." He paused. "Darius Holt is going to have representation at that hearing." "I expect so." "His attorney is Carl B. Scheer." She knew the name. Everyone in Harrow County knew the name. Carl B. Scheer had a reputation for procedural precision that some people called expertise and others called obstruction, depending on which side of a proceeding you were on. "Then I'd better get there first," she said. They drove back in convoy, Rowena and Silas and Elsie in the lead, Raymond behind them, the 2 deputies bringing up the rear in a way that felt, after the morning they had just had, like something approaching justice beginning to organize itself, even if it was doing so imperfectly and on a tight schedule. On the road, Rowena called the lease board office. The receptionist, a woman named Donna, who had worked there for 15 years and whom Rowena had always found precisely and deliberately unhelpful, answered with her standard tone of mild inconvenience. "Donna, this is Rowena Ashcroft. I need to speak with Gerald Pruitt before the hearing." "Mr. Pruitt is in pre-hearing preparation and cannot be. Donna, I am arriving with law enforcement, a material witness, and physical evidence of livestock theft directly relevant to the hearing scheduled at noon. If Mr. Pruitt prefers to conduct the hearing without being informed of that evidence in advance, that is his choice. But I want it on record that I called." A pause. A long one. "I'll pass the message along," Donna said, in a slightly different tone. Rowena ended the call. Silas glanced at her from the driver's seat. "Pruitt's going to call Darius before he calls you back," he said. "Obviously," she said. "That gives Darius 20 minutes to decide how to respond. I want to see what he decides." She looked out the window at the passing scrubland. A man who thinks he's winning responds differently than a man who knows he's been caught. Elsie, in the back seat, had opened her notebook again. She was not drawing now. She was looking at what she had already drawn, the 2 brand marks side by side, rendered with a 9-year-old's hand but with a 9-year-old's accuracy, which was to say, completely accurate and slightly heartbreaking in its clarity. Rowena turned to look at her. "Elsie, at the hearing today, if they ask you, the board might want to ask you questions. You don't have to answer out loud if you don't want to. You can write it down, or draw it, or point. Whatever you need to do." Elsie looked at her steadily. Then she held up the notebook, open to the page with the 2 brands. "Yes," Rowena said. "Exactly like that." The girl nodded once and closed the notebook. The Harrow County Lease Board held its hearings in a low-ceilinged room on the 2nd floor of the county building, which smelled permanently of old carpet and the particular institutional coffee that no government office had ever managed to make properly. There were 8 rows of chairs for observers, a raised table for the 3 board members, and 2 chairs at the front of the room facing the board, which were intended for the petitioner and any representative. When Rowena arrived at 11:47, both chairs at the front were already occupied. Darius Holt sat in the left one. He was wearing a jacket she had seen before, dark wool, well-maintained, and he had the composed expression of a man who has been told that something has gone wrong and has decided, as a matter of strategy, to look like it hasn't. Beside him sat Carl B. Scheer, a trim, gray-haired man of about 60, who was reviewing papers in a leather folder with the practiced calm of someone whose profession requires him to appear unrattled regardless of the circumstances. Darius saw her come in. Something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration. His eyes went from her to Silas to Raymond, and then to the deputies who followed them through the door, and the recalibration happened again, faster. He did not look at Elsie. That, Rowena noted, was interesting. Gerald Pruitt was already at the board table, flanked by his two fellow members. A woman named Hester Cross, who was a retired county assessor and generally the most careful reader in any room, and a man named Tom Aldecoa, who farmed grain on the east side of the county and had a reputation for being the board member most likely to ask the question everyone else was thinking but had decided was impolite. Pruitt himself was 64, thinning-haired, with the measured politeness of a man who had spent decades in small government administration and had learned that measured politeness was an excellent substitute for actual positions. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said as she came in, "we're glad you could make it. I understand you called the office this morning." "I did," she said. She set the cedar fragments on the board table without asking permission. "I'm requesting a brief delay of the formal proceedings to present evidence that directly impacts the board's capacity to rule on this matter." Carl Bashir looked up from his folder. "Mr. Chairman, the board convened this hearing under a properly filed notice, and the petitioner's request for delay is—" "The petitioner," said Raymond Eccles from behind Rowena, "hasn't finished speaking." Bashir looked at Raymond. Something in his expression acknowledged the name without wanting to. Pruitt said, "Raymond, you're here in what capacity?" "Witness and concerned landowner," Raymond said. "In that order." Pruitt looked at the deputies. Solis had taken a position near the door in the quiet way that law enforcement takes positions when they are establishing presence without yet asserting authority. Young Crane was beside him. They did not look like they were there by accident. "All right," Pruitt said carefully. "Mrs. Ashcroft, you have the floor." She had prepared for this on the drive over, organizing what she had into the sequence that would be hardest to procedurally dismiss. She did not begin with accusations. She began with the cedar fragments, which she picked up from the table and held where all three board members could see them. She described what they were, where Elsie had found them, and what the brand impressions on them represented. She described the canyon, the hidden pen, the calves, the Fresh Holt brands over the original Iron Creek marks. She described the vehicle tracks coming from the north. She kept her voice even. She had been angry on the drive. She had allowed herself exactly 15 minutes of that, driving through the scrubland with the evidence in her lap, and then she had put the anger in the same place she put the grief, the bottom of her chest, the cold permanent layer, because anger in a room like this was a weapon you gave to your opponents. She was not going to give Darius Holt anything else. When she finished, the room was quiet. Hester Cross was leaning forward with her reading glasses on, examining one of the photos Rowena had set on the table during her account. Tom Aldecoa was looking at the cedar fragments. Gerald Pruitt was looking at nothing in particular, which was his tell. Rowena had learned from watching him in 2 previous hearings that when he looked at nothing, he was actually thinking harder than he wanted to show. Darius broke the silence. "This is," he said, "a remarkable story." His voice was steady, almost gentle, the way it always was when he was being dismissive. He had perfected over the years the specific tone that made disagreement sound like confusion. "And I feel genuinely sorry for Rowena. I do. She's been through an incredibly difficult year, but I want the board to consider something." He leaned forward slightly. "A handful of calves found in a canyon, branded with my mark, does not automatically constitute theft. Animals move. Marks get touched up when they're faded. And a piece of burned wood that a child found on the ground." "The child," Silas said, from the back of the room. Everyone turned. He was standing near the last row of chairs, and he had said it without aggression, without volume, just plainly enough that it had stopped Darius mid-sentence. Elsie was beside him. She was holding her notebook. "You said a piece of burned wood that a child found," Silas said to Darius. "Say the rest of what you were going to say." Darius looked at him with the evaluating expression of a man deciding how much of a problem this was. "I don't know who you are," he said. "I work for Mrs. Ashcroft," Silas said. "I know who you are. Say the rest of what you were going to say about the evidence a 9-year-old found." Carl Bashir touched Darius's arm briefly. "A lawyer's touch. Settle down. Let me handle this." Darius settled, visibly and with effort. Mr. Chairman, Bashir said smoothly, the board should note that Mrs. Ashcroft has arrived with what amounts to a field observation, some photographs taken on a personal phone, and a report filed by a deputy who has been at the scene for less than an hour. None of this constitutes a completed evidentiary record. The board is empowered to rule on the lease matter as it stands, with the understanding that any criminal investigation proceeds separately through. Gareth, Raymond said. Deputy Solis stepped forward from the door. He held a folded document. He set it on the board table in front of Gerald Pruitt. Field observation report from this morning's site attendance, Mr. Chairman, signed by 2 deputies. It documents the presence of approximately 41 head of young cattle carrying fresh brand marks consistent with the Holt registered brand, over visible underlying marks consistent with the Iron Creek registered brand. That's the language as written. He paused. I also want to note, for the record, that the sheriff has been contacted and a formal criminal investigation is being opened as of approximately 40 minutes ago. Gerald Pruitt looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. The door to the hearing room opened. 3 people came in, neighbors from the south end of the county, a couple named Burtis, and a single man named Harlan Foote, whom Rowena had not spoken to in months, all 3 of them wearing the specific expression of people who have heard something on the way to a place and have arrived at a decision they are not entirely comfortable with, but have made anyway. Behind them came 2 more people she recognized as members of the County Cattlemen's Association, and behind them came a woman who ran the feed store in Caldwell's competitor operation in the next town over, and who had absolutely no reason to be at a Harrow County lease hearing except that she had heard. The room was filling. Darius Holt felt it. Rowena watched him feel it, watched the micro-adjustments in his posture, the way his jaw tightened, the way Carl Bashir leaned toward him and said something very quietly that Darius acknowledged with a small nod, but did not visibly relax from. Mr. Chairman, Bashir said, given the expanded attendance, perhaps a brief recess would be appropriate. I don't think so, said Hester Cross. She had taken her reading glasses off and was looking at Gerald Pruitt. Gerald, we have a field observation report from 2 deputies. We have physical evidence logged and photographed. We have a witness in Raymond Eccles, who I have known for 30 years, and whose word this board has accepted without question on 3 separate occasions. And we have a lease hearing that was filed on the basis of livestock numbers that appear to have been deliberately and criminally reduced. She set her hands flat on the table. I would like to hear from Mr. Holt directly, not his attorney, him. Bashir started to respond. Hester Cross did not look at him. Darius looked at Bashir. Bashir gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Darius looked at the board. He looked at the room, which was now close to full, with people standing along the back wall. The particular crowd that assembles when something has gone from a legal proceeding to a community event, the kind of thing that will be discussed in feed stores and across fence lines for years. He looked at Rowena, and for the first time in 11 months, she saw something in Darius Holt's face that she had not seen before. Not guilt. She did not expect guilt from him, had never expected it, had never been naive enough to believe that a man who had planned this carefully across this much time was going to break open in a public room and confess to the weight of it. What she saw was something more fundamental than guilt. She saw the specific expression of a man who has calculated odds his entire life and has just finished recalculating and does not like the result. I would like, Darius said, to consult with my attorney before making any statements. Of course, Pruitt said. He sounded tired. 10 minutes. They went into the hallway. Rowena watched them go. The room rustled and shifted, the low hum of people deciding where they stood resuming now that the formal tension had a temporary break. Raymond came and stood beside her. He did not say anything. Silas was still in the back. Elsie had moved. Rowena looked and found her up near the board table, where Hester Cross had apparently invited her to look at the photographs. And the 2 of them were bent over the prints together, the 68-year-old retired assessor and the 9-year-old child who did not speak, pointing at the same details with the collaborative focus of people who have independently arrived at the same conclusion and are comparing notes. Tom Aldecoa caught Rowena's eye from the board table. He was a plain-spoken grain farmer who had been on the lease board for 6 years and had the specific quality of a man who had heard a great deal of talk in those 6 years and had learned to distinguish it from what was true. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her and gave one short nod. The kind of nod that means, I see it, I believe it, keep going. She kept going. She stood at the front of that hearing room in her working clothes. She had never changed, there had not been time, and she had stopped caring about it somewhere around the second cedar fragment. And she waited for Darius Holt to finish calculating in the hallway, knowing that whatever he calculated and whatever Carl Bashir advised him, and whatever strategy they landed on in those 10 minutes, she was no longer the woman who had stood alone in her kitchen that morning reading a termination notice. She was a woman with evidence, with witnesses, with a 9-year-old's notebook full of accurate drawings, with a field report from 2 deputies and the weight of Raymond Eccles's 41 years of honest standing in this county, and with Silas Boone at the back of the room, watching the door Darius had gone through with the patient stillness of a man who is not going anywhere. The 10 minutes passed. The hallway door opened. Darius came back in first. Carl Bashir came in behind him, and behind Bashir came 2 of Darius's ranch hands, who had apparently been waiting in the hallway. Men who had worked for him for years, big capable men who knew how to manage cattle and how to take direction, and who had, Rowena realized with a cold clarity, almost certainly been the ones in that canyon. Who had run the branding iron, who had fed and watered those calves through the months they spent hidden in Split Tooth, who had followed directions without asking too many questions about where the directions came from. Both of them were not looking at Darius, they were looking at the floor. Darius sat back down at the front table. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Gerald Pruitt with the expression of a man who has made a calculation and is presenting it with as much dignity as the calculation allows. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "my client would like to make a statement." Bashir spoke. His voice was controlled, precise, and utterly empty of the smoothness it had carried at the start of the hearing. "Mr. Holt acknowledges that the livestock currently located in Split Tooth Canyon were originally Iron Creek cattle. He acknowledges that the rebranding was conducted under his direction. Bashir paused almost imperceptibly, the pause of a lawyer absorbing his own words. He disputes the characterization of these actions as theft and maintains that questions of ownership were, in his understanding, a matter of disputed inheritance following the death of Thomas Ashcroft. He is prepared to cooperate fully with the county investigation." The room was completely still for 3 seconds. Then it was not still at all. Rowena did not move. She had expected this, not the specific language, but the shape of it, the retreat into legalism, the substitution of dispute for crime, the careful reframing that Bashir had constructed in 10 minutes in a hallway. It was inadequate. It was insulting in its inadequacy. And it was also, she recognized with the cold, clear thinking of someone who has moved past anger into something more useful, a confession. Darius Holt had just told the room, had told the lease board, the deputies, the neighbors standing along the back wall, all of it, that he had taken the calves. He addressed it in other language, but the fact of it was now public and attributed. Gareth Solis was already on his radio. Raymond Eccles was already talking to Hester Cross. Elsie had looked up from the photographs at the sound of the room changing, and she was looking at Rowena across the crowded space with those dark, watchful eyes that missed nothing and had missed nothing all morning, and the expression on her face was not triumph. It was simpler than that. It was the expression of someone watching a thing become what it was always going to be, once enough people decided to see it clearly. Rowena held the cedar fragments in both hands. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the specific look he had when something was finally going right, after going wrong for a long time. Not celebration, just a quiet settling, a weight coming off. She thought she understood that look now in a way she hadn't when he was alive to make it. She turned to face Gerald Pruitt. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "I would like the board to proceed with the hearing." Gerald Pruitt looked at Rowena for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. Then he looked at the field observation report still sitting in front of him. Then he looked at Carl Bashir, who was gathering his papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who has just watched a case change shape entirely and is reorganizing accordingly. Then Pruitt looked at Hester Cross, who was already looking at him with the particular expression she had worn since Darius's statement, patient, precise, and entirely done waiting. "The board will proceed," Pruitt said. He said it quietly, not dramatically. The way a man says something when he has finally decided to stop calculating what it will cost him and do the thing that is simply correct. Rowena exhaled. She had not known she was holding her breath until she let it go. The formal portion of the hearing took 40 minutes, which was 38 minutes longer than Rowena had expected and 8 minutes shorter than she had feared. Hester Cross led most of it with the methodical efficiency of a former assessor who understood that the difference between a hearing that produces a clean outcome and one that produces years of appeals is the precision with which the record is built. She walked through each piece of evidence in sequence. She asked Raymond to formally testify to what he had observed in Split Tooth Canyon. She asked Deputy Solis to read aloud the relevant sections of the field observation report. She asked Rowena to identify each photograph by location and content. Throughout all of it, Carl Bashir made exactly 4 procedural objections. Hester Cross addressed each one with the same 2-sentence response. First, acknowledging the procedural point. Second, explaining precisely why it did not apply to the current circumstance. She did it without contempt, without visible satisfaction, just with the flat accuracy of someone who knows the rules better than the person invoking them. Darius sat through all of it. He sat the way Rowena imagined a man sits when he has been told by his attorney to be still and say nothing and has decided, probably for the first time in his life, to take that advice completely. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His face had settled into something that was not quite an expression at all. A blankness that was the result of active maintenance, like a pond that looks calm because someone has been smoothing it from underneath. She watched him the way she had watched him her entire marriage, carefully, without letting him see that she was doing it. Thomas had never fully understood why she watched Darius so closely. He had loved his brother with the particular loyalty of a man who does not find it easy to believe that someone he grew up with could be constructed so differently than he was. Thomas had been honest with such ease that he had sometimes struggled to recognize dishonesty in others, even when it was sitting across the table from him at family dinners. Rowena had always known. She had known from the first time she met Darius 15 years ago at a Holt family gathering, when he had complimented her cooking in a way that was perfectly phrased and had looked at her property assessment paperwork on Thomas's desk in a way he thought she hadn't noticed. She had known, and she had managed it, and she had told Thomas some of it, and not all of it, and now she was sitting in this hearing room watching the thing she had always half expected arrive in its final form, years later than she thought it would, and somehow more calculated than even she had imagined. When Hester Cross finished building the record, she looked at Tom Aldecoa. He had been quiet through most of the formal portion, taking notes on a yellow legal pad with a mechanical pencil, occasionally looking up to examine something being presented or someone speaking. He had the quality of a man absorbing rather than reacting, filing things for use later. "Tom," Hester said. He looked up from his legal pad. He looked at the photographs on the board table, then at the cedar fragments, then at Darius. He took his time. Nobody in the room appeared to be breathing particularly well. "Mr. Holt," Tom Aldecoa said, "your attorney stated that you directed the rebranding. Not that it happened, not that it may have occurred, but that you directed it. Is that an accurate statement on his behalf?" Carl Bashir leaned toward Darius instantly. Darius listened for 2 seconds, then sat back slightly and looked at Tom Aldecoa with the expression of a man who has just done more private arithmetic and has arrived at a number he does not like but cannot refute. "It is," Darius said. The room absorbed that. Not loudly. The people standing along the back wall did not gasp or exclaim. The crowd that had assembled in this room was a frontier county crowd, which is to say, people who process difficult information quietly and in real time, who understand that the significance of something does not require a performance of reaction. But hats moved. A man in the third row named Willis Burtis, who had grazed his cattle adjacent to Iron Creek for 22 years, reached up and removed his hat and held it in his lap. 2 other men did the same, in the specific, involuntary way that people do things when their body has registered something before their mind has finished deciding how to respond to it. It was not a tribute. It was just the instinctive gesture of men who have been raised to remove their hats when something demands acknowledgement and who are acknowledging it. Darius noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes moved across the room and registered each hat that came off, each small shift in the crowd, with the speed of a man who has spent decades reading rooms. And Rowena watched his face in that moment and saw the thing that was worse for him than the legal outcome, worse than the deputies and the evidence, and even the criminal investigation that Solis's radio call had set in motion. She saw him understand that the room had turned, not against him in the dramatic way, No one was shouting, no one had stood up to point, but in the way that actually cost something permanent, quietly, person by person, in the specific movement of a hat brim or the angle of a shoulder or the direction in which a set of eyes looked when he tried to meet them. He had spent 30 years building a reputation in Harrow County. He had given money to projects. He had attended funerals. He had shown up at county meetings and shaken hands and conducted himself with the surface form of a respectable man so consistently and for so long that the surface had become, for most people, indistinguishable from the substance. And now the substance was visible, in 41 calves in a canyon with 2 sets of brands and a 9-year-old's drawings in a notebook and 2 deputies and Raymond Eccles's testimony. And the room could see it. And once a room can see it, the reputation built over 30 years does not fade slowly. It simply stops being believed. All at once, like a structure that was load-bearing something and isn't anymore. Gerald Pruitt cleared his throat. He had the look of a man who has been standing at a fork in a road for a long time and has finally stepped onto one path, not with pleasure, but with the relief that comes from a decision made. "The board is prepared to rule on the lease matter," he said. He looked at his 2 colleagues. Hester Cross nodded once. Tom Aldecoa set down his mechanical pencil. In light of the evidence presented, the field observation report filed by Harrow County Sheriff's deputies, and the sworn testimony of Raymond Eccles as a material witness, the board finds that the operational capacity figures cited in the original termination notice were materially affected by the unlawful removal and rebranding of Iron Creek livestock. He paused. The lease termination notice filed by Darius Holt on behalf of the estate management claim is hereby voided. Iron Creek Range lease is confirmed as active and held in the name of Rowena Ashcroft as primary operator. He stopped speaking. He picked up the termination notice, the same document, or a copy of it, that had been entered into the hearing record, and he folded it once. He set it face down on the table. He did not tear it. He did not make a gesture of it. He just set it down, which was somehow more final. Carl Bashir was writing something on his legal pad. Darius was looking at the table in front of him. Deputy Solis was already moving toward the front of the room, and Rowena understood from the particular way he was moving, measured, purposeful, the walk of someone executing a predetermined action, that the conversation with the sheriff on the radio had included instructions that were now in effect. "Mr. Holt," Solis said when he reached the front table, "I need you to come with me." Darius looked up at him. For a moment, something passed across his face that was too fast and too complicated to name. Then he stood. He buttoned his jacket with 2 precise movements, adjusted his collar. He picked up his hat from the table where he had set it. He looked at Rowena, and she made herself meet his eyes, because she had decided on the drive to town that if this moment came, she was not going to look away from it. He did not say anything. She was not sure what she had expected, some final attempt at reframing, some parting language that tried to restore a version of himself that the morning had dismantled. He had none. He just looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he turned and walked with Deputy Solis toward the door, and Carl Bashir followed with his leather folder and the expression of a man already drafting the next set of motions in his head. The room let out a collective breath that it had apparently been holding for some time. Raymond Eccles, who had been standing to Rowena's left for the duration of the board's ruling, said nothing. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Not a squeeze, not a pat, just the weight of it placed there and removed. A gesture that communicated something she did not have a word for but understood completely. Then Hester Cross was standing in front of her, extending her hand across the board table. "Mrs. Ashcroft," she said, "we owe you an apology. This board should have been paying closer attention to what was happening on Iron Creek for the past several months." Rowena shook her hand. "Yes," she said, "because it was true, and because Hester Cross was the kind of woman who preferred truth to comfort. You should have." Hester Cross accepted that with a short nod. "We'll do better," she said. And then, in a quieter register, "Your husband was a good man. I don't say that to soften anything. I say it because it's true and because it's relevant. What was done here was done to his name as much as to your ranch. I want you to know the board understands that." Rowena did not trust her voice enough to say anything to that, so she simply nodded, and Hester Cross returned to her paperwork, and the hearing room began the slow dissolution of a crowd that has witnessed something and is now carrying it home. But the calves came back to Iron Creek that afternoon. It took 3 trips with a livestock trailer that Raymond Eccles arranged through a neighbor, and Silas drove every one of them. And by 4:41, young cattle were in Rowena's north pasture, making the particular noise that cattle make when they are in new surroundings. Not panicked, just adjusting, investigating the fence line with the methodical bovine skepticism of animals that have learned not to trust enclosures until they have tested every section. Rowena watched from the fence rail. She was tired in a way that went past the body into something more fundamental, the kind of tired that comes after sustained tension releases all at once, and the system that was keeping you upright on adrenaline and necessity suddenly gets the message that the emergency has passed and begins accounting for what it cost. She was also, underneath the tired, something she hadn't felt in 11 months in any form she could identify. Not happy exactly. Not relieved, though she was that. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. Something that felt like the opposite of the hollow that grief had carved in her. Not filled exactly, but different, structural. Like a wall that has been rebuilt after damage and is not quite the same wall, but is a wall again. Silas came and stood at the fence beside her. He had been working since 6 that morning without more than the cup of tea she had given him in her kitchen at the beginning of what had turned out to be a very different day than either of them had anticipated. He had not complained. He had not sought credit at any point in the proceedings, at the canyon, at the hearing, in the logistics of the afternoon. He had simply done what was needed at each juncture and then moved to the next thing. She was aware that she had hired this man without a formal agreement, without discussing terms, without any of the practical conversations that should precede bringing someone onto a property. She had done it on the basis of a phone call to Margaret Reese and the way he stood at her gate and the way his daughter had held up a cedar fragment like a question. Thomas would have done the same thing, and Thomas had not always been right about people, but he had been right more often than not, and she thought, without being willing to bet heavily on it yet, that she was probably right about this one. Fence line on the south pasture needs work, she said, not looking at him. I know, he said. I looked at it this morning, before everything else happened. The east post is rotted through at the base. There are 3 others that are close. Water pump on the west tank has been unreliable since July. I can look at it tomorrow. Might be the seal. Might be something worse. Honest wages, she said. Like you said this morning. I can't tell you yet what that looks like in numbers because I don't know what I'll recover from the livestock claim against Darius's estate. It could be 6 months before there's anything resembling a real accounting. I understand that, he said. The bunkhouse needs... She stopped, started over. There is a bunkhouse. It's not in great shape. There's a wood stove that works and a roof that mostly holds. I'd want it inspected before winter. Elsie and I have slept in worse, he said. Not as a bid for sympathy, just as a relevant fact. She looked down the fence line at the pasture where the calves were settling. The evening light was coming in low from the west, the specific quality of late afternoon light in high, dry country that makes everything look more permanent than it is, or perhaps exactly as permanent as it actually is. She had never been sure which. I'm going to ask you something, she said, and you can tell me it's none of my business. All right? Your partner, the one who drank, the one who cost you the mountain place. Was that someone you trusted the way you trusted yourself? He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. He was my oldest friend. I knew he drank. I told myself it was manageable because I wanted the partnership more than I wanted to be honest about the risk. He paused. That was my mistake, not his. He was what he was from the beginning. I just decided to read him as something else for a long time. She looked at him then. He was looking at the cattle, not at her. That's an honest answer, she said. You asked an honest question. They stood there for a while. The light kept coming down. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the older Iron Creek cows, one of the 18 who had stayed through everything, had moved toward the returned calves and was making a low sound that was not quite distress and not quite welcome, but something between the two. The sound of a herd reconstituting itself, finding its edges again. Elsie appeared at Rowena's other side. She had been somewhere in the barn for the past hour, doing what, Rowena did not know. She was carrying something, a cedar piece, which made Rowena's chest clench for a half-second before she looked more closely and saw that it was different from the evidence fragments. This cedar was small and smooth, old, the kind you find in the remains of a structure that is weathered for years. One face of it was flat and had been rubbed clean. Elsie held it out to Rowena. On the flat face, in the stub pencil lines that Rowena now recognized as Elsie's hand, was the Iron Creek brand. Drawn carefully, accurately, with the same precision the child had brought to everything else all day. Just the brand. No gloss, no decoration. The mark itself, clear and permanent as if it had been pressed there. Rowena took it, held it in her palm. "Thank you," she said to Elsie, meaning it for the brand and for this morning and for the cedar fragments and for the particular quality of attention this child had brought to her land when nobody else had been looking. Meaning it for all of it. Elsie looked at her. Then she looked at the cattle in the north pasture. Then back at Rowena, and this time the almost smile from this morning arrived and actually completed itself. Brief, real, entirely without performance. And then she turned and went back toward the barn. Silas watched her go. His expression was the one Rowena had seen on his face in the truck that morning, talking about Elsie's mother. That combination of something like grief and something like pure and helpless admiration, the way a parent looks at a child who has grown into their particular kind of person, and you realize that what they have become has exceeded what you imagined for them, not because they're extraordinary, just because they are unmistakably, stubbornly themselves. "She's something," Rowena said. "Yes," he said. "She is." Raymond Eccles stopped by at dusk, before he drove home. He stood in the kitchen doorway, not coming in, just standing in the frame the way neighbors do when they have something to say and are not sure how long it is going to take. "I should have come out here months ago," he said. He had said this once already, in the canyon, but he was saying it again because he meant it differently now. In the canyon, it had been acknowledgement. Now it was something closer to accountability. "Yes," Rowena said. "You already said that." "I know. I'm saying it again because once wasn't enough." He looked at his hat in his hands. "I told myself I was being neutral, staying out of a family matter." He looked up. "But it wasn't a family matter. It was a crime in progress, and I had enough information to ask questions that I didn't ask." She looked at him. Raymond Eccles was 73 years old, and he had lived his entire life in Harrow County, and he had a reputation for integrity that this morning had been less impressive than it appeared. She knew that he knew that, and she knew that this conversation was costing him something, and she found that she did not want to either punish him for it or relieve him of it. "Are you going to ask questions now when they need asking?" she said. He met her eyes. "Yes." "Then we're square," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. He was almost at his truck when he turned back. "That man you hired," he said. "Silas Boone. What about him?" "He moves like somebody who's worked hard land for a long time. Not just worked it, thought about it while he was working it. That's rarer than it sounds." "I know," she said. Ed Raymond's mouth did something that almost qualified as a smile. "Thomas would have hired him inside of 10 minutes, he said. She waited until Raymond's taillights had cleared the gate before she let that land all the way. It landed slowly, the way things do when they are both painful and correct, settling into the place in her chest where Thomas still lived permanently and quietly, alongside the grief and alongside the anger and alongside the 11 months of holding Iron Creek together by main force of will. Thomas would have hired him inside of 10 minutes. She had hired him in about 15, which was close enough. Oh. That night, after Silas and Elsie were in the bunkhouse, and the cattle were settled and the cedar fragment with the hand-drawn Iron Creek brand was on the kitchen table where she could see it, Rowena sat at Thomas's desk with the lease board's written confirmation in her hands. Iron Creek Range, active lease. Held in the name of Rowena Ashcroft, primary operator. Not widow, not surviving spouse, not Thomas Ashcroft's wife. Rowena Ashcroft. Her name, in the line where a name goes when a name means something. She had not cried this morning when she read the termination notice. She had not cried in the canyon or in the hearing room or at the fence, watching the calves come home. She had held it all in the cold, useful layer where she kept the things that would break her if she let them arrive at full weight before the work was done. The work was done. For today. She put her face in her hands and let it arrive. It arrived as exhaustion and relief and the specific grief of a person who has been holding something alone for so long that putting it down feels violent. The way setting down a heavy thing leaves your arms shaking. Not from weakness, but from the sudden absence of the weight that had become your entire muscular reality for months. It arrived as Thomas's face, specific and vivid in a way that dreams never quite managed. The actual Thomas, imperfect and warm, who had loved this land and loved her and had not lived long enough to see what it nearly cost, or what it had taken to keep it. She did not cry for long. That was not her nature, and she had made peace with her nature years ago. When she straightened up, she looked at the cedar piece on the desk, the brand Elsie had drawn, clean and clear. She set the lease confirmation down beside it. Outside, the wind had come up from the west the way it did in early evening on the range, moving through the scrubland with a sound that was not quite silence and not quite voice, just the particular tone of open country at the end of a long day. She had heard that sound every night for 12 years at Iron Creek, and she heard it now, and it sounded the same as it always had, which was the point. Some things were still the same, some things were going to be different. The difference between tonight and every other night in the past 11 months was that for the first time, the shape of what was different was one she had chosen. Not had imposed on her, not had taken from her, not had arrived at through attrition and grief and the slow erosion of being alone. Chosen. By her, in the canyon and in the hearing room and at the gate this morning when she had looked at a man with a mended coat and decided that honesty deserved a chance. It was not a resolution. Nothing that had happened today had resolved the fact that her husband was gone, or that the next season would be hard, or that 41 calves needed to be integrated into a herd that was still well below what Iron Creek required to be genuinely healthy. Nothing had resolved the criminal case against Darius, which would be long and ugly and would require her to show up and testify and relive pieces of the past year in a way she was not looking forward to. Nothing was resolved. It was just different, moving in a direction that was hers. She turned off the desk lamp. She went to the kitchen window and stood for a moment looking out at the yard, at the bunkhouse where a light still showed faintly under the door, at the north pasture where the cattle were dark shapes in the dark grass, at the brand rack by the barn that Thomas had built in the first year they owned the place, standing the way it always had against the sky. She was going to get some sleep. She was going to get up tomorrow and look at the West Water pump with Silas and walk the south fence line and count the cattle in the morning the way Thomas had taught her. Twice, because the count that matters is always the second one. She was going to call Margaret Reese back and thank her for the reference. She was going to call the county to ask about the timeline on the livestock claim against Darius's estate. She was going to do all of those things, and they were going to be hard, and some of them were going to go wrong, and none of it was going to be easy. She was still here. Iron Creek was still here. And tomorrow the work would still be waiting, the way it always was, patient and indifferent and necessary, which was all she had ever needed it to be. The West Water pump was worse than a bad seal. Silas had it open by 7 the next morning, crouched in the dirt beside the tank with his sleeves rolled and a flashlight clamped between his teeth. And when he called Rowena over and showed her what was inside, she recognized immediately that this was not a repair. The casing had cracked, probably during the hard freeze in November, and someone, she suspected herself in the numb and distracted months that followed, had noticed the reduced output and adjusted the pressure valve upward to compensate, which had accelerated the internal wear until what should have been a seasonal maintenance item had become a replacement job that was going to cost her more than she had in liquid cash at this exact moment. She stood over it with her coffee and looked at it the way you look at bad news that is not surprising, without shock, with the specific weariness of a person adding an item to a list that is already long. "I can rig a temporary feed from the east tank," Silas said, pulling the flashlight from between his teeth. "Buy you 2, maybe 3 weeks before you need the new unit. It won't be pretty, and it'll need checking every couple of days, but the cattle won't suffer for it." "How much is the new unit?" He named a figure. She calculated against what she knew was in the operating account, which was not much, and against the livestock claim she had filed against Darius's estate, which the county attorney had told her could take anywhere from 60 days to 6 months, to result in any actual disbursement depending on how Darius's legal representation decided to play the asset question. "Do the temporary rig," she said. "Already planning on it," he said, and went back to work. That was October. The first real frost came the following week, and with it the particular quality of work that cold imposes on a ranch. The additional hours, the checking of water lines, the monitoring of the herd for the early signs of respiratory illness that a hard autumn can bring into young cattle, especially young cattle that had spent months in a canyon under conditions that were adequate but not ideal. Two of the returned calves developed mild infections in their first weeks back. Silas caught both of them early, before they needed more than a course of treatment, because he was up before dawn every morning checking the herd with the consistency of someone who understands that the early catch is the cheap catch, that the alternative is a vet bill you cannot afford or an animal you cannot save. Rowena watched him work and thought often about what Margaret Reese had said. He is not easy. He'll tell you when you're wrong. She had seen the first part of that within a week. He had told her, flat and direct, that the way she had been storing the winter feed was creating conditions for mold growth. And he had been right. And she had known he was right before he finished the sentence. And she had been annoyed anyway, which was the honest version of what happened when someone is right about something you should have caught yourself. She told him he was right. He nodded and moved on. No extending it, no milking the moment, no careful performance of graciousness in response to her concession. Just correct, acknowledged, next thing. She was starting to understand that this was simply how he was built. He did not carry the ordinary social padding that most people apply to difficult truths. It was not rudeness. He was unfailingly courteous in the baseline ways, the ways that cost nothing and disrespect no one. It was just an absence of the particular dishonesty that most people mistake for politeness, the softening and the qualifying and the careful framing that is designed less to protect the listener than to protect the speaker from the discomfort of having said something true. Thomas had been different in this way. Thomas had been warm in the communicated sense, easy with people, able to move through difficult conversations without leaving anyone feeling scraped. Rowena had loved that about him. She had also, if she was honest, occasionally found it frustrating, the way he sometimes chose warmth over precision when precision was what a situation required. It had cost him, a few times, not mortally, but it had cost him. Silas did not have that problem. He had different ones. The criminal case against Darius Holt moved with the slow, grinding pace of county legal proceedings that involve property, animals, financial fraud, and a defendant with representation experienced enough to find procedural footholds in every surface. Carl Bashir filed 4 motions in the first 6 weeks. The county attorney, a capable but perpetually overextended woman named Sonia Vries, contested each one. Rowena tracked the docket online and received updates by phone and tried to keep the case from occupying more mental space than it deserved, which was harder than it sounds when the case was, in the most direct sense, about whether someone would be held accountable for systematically dismantling the life she had built. She testified once before the end of the year, in a deposition that lasted 3 hours and covered every interaction she'd had with Darius in the 12 months preceding the hearing and the 12 months that came before that. Carl Bashir conducted the deposition with precise, methodical patience, looking for inconsistencies, for moments of uncertainty, for any gap in her account that could be widened into reasonable doubt. She answered every question with the same flat accuracy she had used in the hearing room. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She did not show emotion. She came out of it exhausted in a specific way that was different from physical exhaustion. The exhaustion of precision maintained under sustained pressure, of being accurate when every instinct toward normal human imprecision would have been understandable and exploited. She sat in her truck in the parking lot of the county attorney's office afterward and let herself be still for 10 minutes before she drove home. Silas had dinner ready when she got back. Not elaborate, pasta and vegetables and bread. The kind of meal that says someone paid attention to the time and noticed you hadn't eaten. She sat down and ate it without commenting on it, and he sat across from her with his own plate and did not ask how it went because she would tell him when she was ready, and he understood that. Elsie was drawing at the end of the table. She had been in school for 6 weeks by then, the elementary school in Caldwell, which was a 20-minute drive that Silas made every morning and afternoon without complaint. The school had flagged in the first week that Elsie was not verbal in the classroom. Silas had explained the situation to the teacher, a young woman named Ms. Arroyo, who had, to her considerable credit, responded by finding 3 different accommodation strategies within a week and implementing them without drama. Elsie had been drawing and writing her responses and occasionally, apparently, surprising the entire class by raising her hand and providing answers that were correct in ways that suggested she had been paying attention to everything, always, which anyone who spent more than an hour around the child could have told the school on day one. "How was school?" Rowena asked her. Elsie looked up. She reached into her notebook and flipped to a page near the front and showed Rowena a drawing of something that was clearly an animal, a calf, from the proportions, with exaggerated ears and a skeptical expression. "Is that supposed to be one of ours?" Rowena asked. Elsie nodded, with the almost smile. Then she wrote something at the bottom of the page and held it up. It read, "We drew our favorite animals. I did all the calves, but Miss Arroyo said I had to pick just one." Rowena looked at her. "Just one?" Elsie shrugged with theatrical resignation and went back to drawing. Silas, across the table, had a look on his face that he quickly returned to his plate, but not quickly enough. Rowena found that she was smiling. It arrived without her planning it, the small, involuntary kind that happens in the space before you can decide whether to allow it or not. She let it stay. The livestock claim was settled in January. Not for the full amount Sonia Vries had argued for, because nothing in law is ever settled for the full amount argued for, but for enough. Enough to replace the water pump with a unit that would last 15 years and still have sufficient remainder to fund the fence repairs, and a small reserve that Rowena put directly into the operating account and did not think of as anything except infrastructure. Not a windfall, not a restoration of everything that had been taken, just enough, which was what enough meant, sufficient to continue. Darius Holt pleaded no contest to 2 counts of livestock misappropriation and 1 count of document fraud in February. Carl Bashir had negotiated it down from the original 5-count filing, which Rowena had expected. She had not gone into this with any illusion that the law was going to extract from Darius Holt a punishment that fully matched the scale of what he had done. The law rarely did that. It extracted what it could prove, applied within the constraints of what the jurisdiction could support, shaped by what the attorneys on both sides could negotiate. What he received was a substantial fine, a 3-year suspended sentence contingent on no further offenses, and a permanent bar from holding any management role in Harrow County land operations. He would not go to jail. She had made her peace with that before the plea was even offered, because making peace with imperfect outcomes in advance is the only way to avoid being destroyed by them after the fact. What mattered was the bar. What mattered was that Darius Holt could not do to anyone else in Harrow County what he had done to her, not through the machinery of land management and lease boards and county charters, and not under the protection of a reputation that was now permanently and publicly discredited. The day the plea was entered, Raymond Eccles called her. "I heard," she said when she picked up. "I know," he said. "I wanted to call anyway." A pause. "How are you feeling about it?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm feeling like it's over," she said. "I'm feeling like I need to go check on my cattle." Raymond made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That's about right," he said. "Rowena, for what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much at this point, I am proud of what you did, not just at the hearing, all of it, all year." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about the morning in March when she had found the 2 carcasses in the north pasture and accepted the explanation that was easier than the truth, and about the months she had spent managing grief when she should have been asking harder questions, and about all the ways she had been imperfect in this situation, which were real and which she had not fully resolved with herself and might not, entirely, for a long time. "I made a lot of mistakes," she said. "So did everyone," Raymond said. "The difference is you corrected yours." She let that sit for a moment. It was not a complete absolution. She did not think she deserved one, but it was accurate enough to accept. "Thank you for coming to the canyon," she said, "and for what you did at the hearing." "Least I could do," he said. "Literally, the least." She smiled at that, a small, real one. "Get some sleep, Raymond." "You too," he said, and hung up. Spring came slowly to Iron Creek, the way it always did at that elevation, not arriving cleanly but pushing in against the tail of winter, 2 warm days followed by a hard freeze, the ground thawing and refreezing in cycles until some morning in late March. When you walk outside and the air simply smells different, the specific green cold smell of things beginning again under the mud. That means the frost has finally released its grip on the soil and the year is actually going to move forward. The calves had wintered well. Better than Rowena had expected, honestly. The 2 with early infections had recovered fully, and the integration with the original Iron Creek herd had gone more smoothly than she had predicted, partly because Silas had managed the introduction with a methodical patience that seemed to understand the social dynamics of cattle in a way that looked almost intuitive, but was actually, she had come to understand, the product of very long and very careful observation. The herd was at 58 now, not where Iron Creek needed to be for full operational capacity. She was working towards 75 as the minimum sustainable number, but well above the threshold that had threatened the lease, and growing. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Rowena was working the east fence line when she heard the truck. She turned and recognized it immediately. The same battered vehicle that had pulled through her gate on the morning that had changed everything. Engine rough at idle, driver's door opening in the same sequence it always did. But Silas was not getting out. I was standing beside the truck, looking at her with an expression that was different from his working expression, and different from his careful, neutral expression, and different from the look she had seen on his face in the kitchen that first morning. It was uncertain in a way he almost never was, which made it immediately more noticeable than anything else about him. She walked over. She closed the last section of fence she'd been working and walked over with the wire stretcher still in her hand. "Something wrong with the cattle?" she said. "No," he said. "Cattle are fine." "Pump?" "Pump is fine." He looked at the truck briefly, then back at her. He was holding his hat. She had noticed over the months that he held his hat when he was working through something. Not a nervous habit exactly, more a displacement, something for his hands to do while his mind was elsewhere. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I've been offered a position," he said. "Management position. Full operation, north of here, Cutter Valley. It's a good outfit. The pay is—" He named a figure that was considerably more than honest wages on a recovering ranch. "And there's a proper house. For Elsie." Rowena heard all of that. She processed it with the same flat attention she had trained herself to apply to information she did not want to receive, the way you hold something at arm's length until you have fully looked at it before you decide how to feel about it. "When did this come in?" she said. 3 weeks ago, he said. 3 weeks? She looked at him. "You've been thinking about it for 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you're telling me now." "I'm telling you now because I've decided not to take it," he said. "And I wanted you to know that I decided that before I told you about it, so you'd know the sequence." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning air was cold and smelled like early spring, and the cattle were audible in the east pasture and somewhere near the barn. Elsie was probably doing whatever Elsie did in the mornings before school, which was usually some form of silent investigation that Rowena had long since stopped trying to anticipate. "Why not?" she said. He turned his hat once in his hands. "Because Cutter Valley is a job," he said. "This is—" He stopped, started again. "I know what this place is. I've known since the first morning. Some ranches are just land and cattle and work, and some of them are something else, something that took a long time to build and took a lot from the person who built it, and you can feel that when you're on them, if you're paying attention." He paused. "I'm staying because this is the second kind, and because I think it's going to be something worth being part of, if the person running it wants help running it." Rowena was quiet. She was aware of the wire stretcher in her hand and the cold air and the fence line that still had 3 sections to go before noon, and she was aware of all the practical and impractical dimensions of what he had just said, including the ones that neither of them was going to address directly this morning on a Tuesday in late March with work still to do. "The person running it does want help," she said, "on the clear understanding that honest wages improve when the operation gets back to where it should be." "That's understood," he said, "and on the understanding that you keep telling me when I'm wrong about things." "That one was never negotiable," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it second." Something shifted in his face at that, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one, the small, warm movement that was the closest he came to showing satisfaction. She had learned over the months to read the small versions of things on Silas Boone, because the large versions did not come often. She went back to the fence. He went to the barn. That was the whole of it, which was exactly how it needed to be. Elsie spoke in full sentences for the first time in Rowena's presence on a Sunday afternoon in April, and it was not dramatic and it was not preceded by any indication that it was coming, which was exactly in keeping with how Elsie approached everything. They were at the kitchen table, Rowena was going through the spring operational calendar, which involved a spreadsheet she had constructed over the winter that was more detailed than anything she had produced in the Thomas years, when she had relied on Thomas's particular combination of experience and instinct, and had not built as many of the systems that instinct eventually needs when the person who has it is gone. Elsie was doing homework. Mrs. Arroyo had assigned a short writing piece about something the student found interesting, and Elsie had been working on it in her notebook for 20 minutes. She put her pencil down and read what she had written silently once. Then she looked at Rowena. "Can I read you something?" she said. Her voice was quiet and slightly lower than Rowena had expected, with a quality of careful formation in each word, the way people sound when they are speaking in a language they know well but have not used in some time. Precise, deliberate, the words placed exactly where they were intended to go. Rowena set down her pen. "Yes," she said, and made sure her voice was level, because she understood instinctively that the worst thing she could do in this moment was make it feel significant in a way that made the child self-conscious. Elsie looked at the notebook. She read, "The most interesting thing I know about is brands. A brand tells you who something belongs to. If you burn one brand over another one, the first brand is still there underneath. You can't really erase it. You just put something on top of it and hope people don't look too close. I think that is also true about other things besides cattle. I think it is true about people, and I think it is true about places." She finished and looked up. Rowena did not say anything for a moment. She looked at this 9-year-old child who had come to her gate in October with a cedar fragment and silence and a quality of attention that had, in the span of a single morning, unraveled something that months of legal and practical pressure had failed to crack. And she thought about what it meant to be 9 years old and have arrived at that particular understanding already. About the specific kind of childhood that teaches you, that early, that the oldest mark is the true one. "That's a very good piece of writing," Rowena said. Elsie looked at it again. "Ms. Arroyo will probably say it needs a concluding sentence." "Ms. Arroyo might be right," Rowena said. "What would you add?" Elsie thought about it. She picked up her pencil. She wrote something at the bottom of the page, looked at it, and then held the notebook across the table. The added sentence read, "That is why it matters who is looking." Rowena read it twice. Then she slid the notebook back. "That's your concluding sentence," she said. "Don't change it." Elsie nodded, satisfied in the private way of a person who was used to reaching conclusions on her own and did not need them validated but did not mind when they were. She closed the notebook and went back to her other homework. After a while, Silas came in from outside, boots muddy from the south pasture work, and poured himself a coffee and sat down at the table with the casualness of someone who has been entering the same kitchen long enough that the room has stopped being someone else's room and has become, in the functional sense, a shared one. He looked at Elsie's closed notebook, then at Rowena's face, which was probably carrying something she hadn't fully cleared yet. "What happened?" he said. "She read me her homework," Rowena said. He understood immediately what that meant. He looked at Elsie, who was doing arithmetic with her pencil, and did not look up. Something moved across his face, that combination of grief and admiration that Rowena had come to recognize as his specific expression for his daughter. And then he looked down at his coffee and let it settle quietly, the way you hold something precious without drawing attention to the holding. "Good homework," he said, to the room in general. "Very good," Rowena said. Elsie, without looking up from her arithmetic, allowed herself the smallest nod. In May, Rowena had the brand rack rebuilt. The original had been standing since Thomas's first year on the property, and it was sound structurally but weathered past the point where maintenance was a better investment than replacement. Silas built the new one over 3 days from cedar posts he selected himself from the timber supplier in town, choosing pieces with the particular grain density that holds up to 20 years of weather, rejecting 2 that looked adequate but that he said would be trouble within 5. She did not question his selections. She had learned, by May, which things to question and which things to defer to someone whose judgment had earned deferral. When it was done, she asked him to come with her to the barn. She had kept the burned cedar piece, the original one, the first fragment Elsie had found near the barn door on that October morning, in her desk drawer through the winter. She had meant to put it somewhere permanent once things settled, but settling had taken time, and the drawer had served as interim arrangement, She took it out and carried it to the new brand rack and set it at the highest beam, pressed into a natural notch in the wood where it fit as if the cedar had grown anticipating it. She did not hammer it in or attach it with anything. She just set it there, in the notch, balanced. Silas stood beside her. He looked at the cedar fragment in its notch at the top of the rack. He did not say anything for a moment. "She's going to want to know you did that," he said finally. "I know," Rowena said. "She can come see it after school. She'll probably draw it." Probably. He looked at the rack, at the cedar, at the Iron Creek brand pressed into the base post where she had had it burned fresh into the new wood. Clean, deep, permanent. He looked at the north pasture where the herd was visible in the morning light. He looked at Iron Creek Range the way she had seen him look at it since the first morning, the way that meant he was doing the other arithmetic, the one with the non-financial numbers, and arriving at conclusions he found worth arriving at. "It's a good ranch," he said. "I know," she said. "I've always known." That was the truth. Through all of it, the grief and the slow theft and the terrible months and the morning of the hearing and the winter of the legal proceedings and all the hard, imperfect work of rebuilding. She had known that underneath everything that had been layered over the top of it, Iron Creek was what it had always been. The first mark was still there. It had always been there. It had just required someone to look closely enough to see it. That was the thing about the oldest marks. You couldn't really erase them. You could put something on top of them and hope nobody looked too close. But somebody always did. And that mattered. The looking mattered. Not the heroism of it, not the drama. Just the plain human act of paying attention when it would have been easier not to, of staying present to what is real when what is comfortable offers itself as a substitute. Elsie had done it first. A 9-year-old child with a stub pencil and a notebook and eyes that had learned to look carefully because she had grown up in a world that required it. Raymond Eccles had done it late, but had done it. Hester Cross had done it in the hearing room. Deputy Solis had done it in the canyon. Rowena had done it, finally, that October morning when she had taken the cedar fragment from a child's hand and let herself actually see what it meant. The ranch was not saved by a dramatic gesture or a single act of courage, though there had been moments that looked like those from the outside. It was saved by accumulation, by the small exact choices made repeatedly under pressure, by the refusal to accept insufficient explanations, by the willingness to be wrong and correct it, by the trust extended carefully to people who had earned the extending. That was not a story that made a clean arc. It did not resolve into simplicity. Rowena was still 52 years old and still tired and still carrying grief that did not have a resolution, only an accommodation. Silas was still a man with his own history of loss and poor judgment in at least one important relationship and a daughter who was teaching herself, one sentence at a time, to trust a voice she had put away when the world asked something too hard of her too early. The cattle still needed counting twice each morning because the count that matters is always the second one. The south fence line had 2 posts that were going to need replacing before winter. None of that had changed. None of it would become simple. But the brand rack stood at the barn where it was supposed to stand, with a cedar fragment at its highest beam that had started all of this by being noticed. And Rowena Ashcroft's name was on a lease in the county office that confirmed what she had known since before the grief made it hard to hold on to. This was hers. Not inherited, not disputed, not conditional on being someone's widow or someone's survivor. Hers, because she had stayed when leaving would have been easier, and fought when surrender would have been accepted, and let people in when isolation would have been safer. That evening, the 4 of them ate dinner at the kitchen table. Rowena, Silas, Elsie, and Raymond Eccles, who had been invited because Rowena had decided that the people who show up when you need them deserve to be fed, even when they showed up late. Raymond had brought a pie, which was slightly overcooked at the edges, and which nobody mentioned and which he was visibly self-conscious about, which was more endearing than a perfect pie would have been. Elsie ate her dinner and looked at each person at the table in her systematic way, and then, at some point between the main course and the pie, quietly got up and went to her room and came back with her notebook and set it open at the center of the table. On the page she had opened to was the drawing she had made in October in the hearing room. The 2 brand marks side by side, the old Iron Creek mark and the counterfeit Holt mark above it. She had been adding to it over the months, small additions around the edges, details from the canyon and the hearing and the winter and the spring. It had become something between a document and a record and a piece of art, all 3 without quite being any one of them. She did not say anything. She just opened it and left it there, in the center of the table, where everyone could see it. Raymond looked at it for a long time. He looked at Rowena. "She's something," he said. "Yes," Rowena said, "she is." Silas was looking at his daughter with the expression Rowena had seen so many times by now that she had stopped cataloging it and had just come to accept it as part of the furniture of any room that Elsie was in. That combination of helpless admiration and the specific parental ache of a person who loves someone they cannot protect from everything and has made an uneasy peace with that fact. Elsie accepted the collective attention for approximately 4 seconds. Then she closed her notebook, picked up her fork, and indicated with a gesture toward the pie that it was time to move on. They moved on. Outside, the wind came down from the ridge the way it did in the evenings at Iron Creek. Steady, consistent, moving through the scrubland and across the north pasture, where the herd was settled, and through the yard where the new brand rack stood at the barn with a cedar fragment balanced at its highest beam. The same wind that had blown across this property for decades before any of them arrived and would continue after. The wind did not care about any of it. It just moved through. But the brand rack stood, and the brand in its base post was clear and deep and would still be there in 20 years, underneath whatever the weather added to the surface of it. The first mark, still true. Inside, someone laughed at something Raymond said. It might have been Silas, which would have been the first time. Or it might have been Rowena, which had happened more in the past few months than in the 11 before. Outside, one of the calves made a sound in the pasture. The light from the kitchen window fell across the yard the way it had fallen across it every night for 12 years, warm in particular, the kind of light that means someone is home. Iron Creek was not a symbol. It was not a monument to resilience or a lesson about strength or a proof of anything general. It was a working ranch in a dry county that had survived a hard year because enough people had, at enough of the right moments, decided to look clearly at what was in front of them and act on what they saw. That was all. That was everything.